and welcome to this webinar on carbon markets, in which Jillian Karen Kambelich, Yanis Bille, and myself, Silke Goldberg, we will discuss from an HSF and Chapter Zero perspective the role that carbon markets are playing in relation to climate change. And this is going to be hopefully an informal discussion in which we will touch upon a variety of topics pertaining to both obligatory and voluntary carbon markets, the Paris Agreement, and what role directors, both executive and non-executive directors, can play in this context. But first, I'm going to invite everybody in this discussion to introduce themselves. Jillian, would you like to start?
Thank you, Silke, and I'm delighted to be here tonight. This is such an important subject. I'm here representing Chapter Zero. I'm one of the founding board members of Chapter Zero, and our mission and our purpose is to help prepare non-executive directors to really lead on climate change and to be aware of their role and to be well prepared for that discussion in their boardrooms, so that their companies in turn move forward and can move from sort of pledges to transition plans. And tonight's topic is really important. I also I head the board evaluation practice at Fidelio Partners, and I sit on the German-British Forum. So this is a topic that is very relevant in all those contexts. Delighted to be here tonight, Silke.
Thank you, Jillian. Yanis, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. My name is Yanis Bille. I'm an energy lawyer at Herbert Smith Freehills, specializing particularly on climate change and ESG matters, with a focus on carbon markets.
Thank you. And finally, I'm Silke Goldberg. I'm a partner at HSF. I'm the global head of ESG at HSF, and I'm also, together with Jillian, on the board of Chapter Zero. But enough of the introductions. We're now going immediately in medias res and to discuss aspects of carbon markets.
Thank you, Silke. And so tonight this is designed really as a discussion, and I'm very interested in particular in the sort of the perspective of the board, but I think it clearly has a much broader application than that. But perhaps just to kick off, perhaps we can have some definitions. You know, we all talk about carbon markets and we talk in the domestic context, in an international context, but could we just take a step back? As I said, some definitions perhaps. What are the carbon markets? What do they do? How do they work?
Of course, Jillian, I will take this. So broadly, there are two separate families of carbon markets. On the one hand, we have the obligatory carbon markets, and then there are the voluntary carbon markets. Obligatory carbon markets, well, really, as the name suggests, they're mandatory, led by legislation perhaps, or by binding industry agreement. And that really means that companies who are subject to these markets, so rules describe in the legal framework, and there is generally an enforcing organization as well, a national or regional regulator that oversees the relevant schemes. So perhaps the two most well-known examples in this context in Europe are the European ETS, so the European Union Emission Trading Scheme, and post-Brexit, the UK Emission Trading Scheme. There are other schemes, of course, but these are perhaps taken together represent the biggest of the mandatory or obligatory carbon markets. Typically, obligatory carbon markets come as a cap and trade market, which is a design feature. And ultimately, that means that the total number of emission certificates in the market is capped, therefore allowing the market basically to drive decarbonization by reducing over time the total available number of emission certificates. And that means that that's the cap part, and the trade part is then that certificates may be traded amongst market participants, so eligible companies or obligated companies that are subject to the relevant scheme. Then on the other side, we have voluntary carbon markets. And again, as it says on the tin, they are voluntary in nature. And that means that the market participants choose to participate within that voluntary market, very often and typically to purchase carbon offsets of different varieties. And we can come to that in a little bit more detail. So there's really a very strong difference in the degrees of regulation between the two, but also amongst different carbon markets. Yanis, do you want to come in and elaborate on any of those things?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe in relation to the kind of obligatory carbon markets and with examples that Silke's given in relation to the EU ETS. Now we're talking here about a market that is quite mature, and that differentiates it from some of the voluntary markets or some other mandatory markets that are quite young and have only been set up recently. And it really does show the evolution that markets can go through and the size or the complexity that they can achieve. And ultimately all tied back to the ultimate intention here to have a overall carbon reduction and use it as a kind of decarbonization enabling tool. So when we look, for example, at the EU ETS, it has a reduction factor that is set currently at 2.1%, but that is currently being negotiated to be reduced at a higher rate. At the moment, negotiations are looking at, for example, 4.1%. So we're looking at something that can have a very strong impact at the overall decarbonization expedience of in-scope entities within that. And it can also really frame an entire nation's decarbonization push or general kind of a journey.
Thank you. It's very helpful, but also a very fragmented situation, that we're not looking at one cohesive response. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about a more global approach. Could you perhaps take us back to the Paris Agreement, and if we take that as a starting point, what does the Paris Agreement have to say about carbon markets?
So the people were actually really excited about this because the Paris Agreement is the first attempt really to provide a much more global approach to fragmented carbon markets. And Article 6 is sort of the key word here, together with what we call the Paris Rulebook. And I'm going to explain both Article 6 and then the Paris Rulebook as well. So, and allow me to sort of bring out legal aspects of this for a moment. So Article 6 covers a variety of aspects of global carbon markets and carbon market design. So first of all, Article 6.2 covers bilateral actions between signatory parties or signatory states to the Paris Agreement to reduce or remove greenhouse gas emissions. Then Article 6.4 creates what we call a new multilateral mechanism to replace the old Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM. You may have heard that in relation to the Kyoto Protocol, the CDM and the Joint Implementation Agreement approaches were mechanisms which allowed for a form of carbon trading, but for a variety of reasons, they didn't quite work so well, and there were a number of design issues, and so they didn't really fully meet expectations. So Article 6.4 is trying to create a new modernized mechanism, replacing in particular the CDM. Article 6.8 then goes and addresses specifically non-market international cooperation between governments. The rules that Article 6.8 is trying to create here, is trying to stimulate, cover both government to government and government to private sector market. And that's really where sort of the carbon trading element might come in. And there are some signs that the new rules will guide the practices of fully private sector or voluntary carbon market activities. So therefore, looking also forward to COP27, perhaps if there were all eyes will be on what's happening globally with the voluntary carbon market regulation. However, we've talked about markets quite a lot. Neither Article 6.2 or 6.4 actually talk about markets. Instead, what they do, in the legal text, they provide for the norms and tools to ensure common approaches, which could contribute to a country's nationally defined contribution under the Paris Agreement, or the NDC. And these approaches can then range from one country perhaps financing another country's energy or transport sector efficiency upgrades, or indeed purchasing carbon offsets in that country's forests, heathlands, or indeed wetlands. So yeah, what the Article 6 text does, is that it clarifies how international carbon markets involving governments should perhaps function. And to help ensure reductions and that these are actually real and grounded in reality, and that they're additional and verifiable, private markets should then also follow the norms set out in this article and the standards that are created by implication, and consider to move to more stringent approaches, regardless of whether they're actually directly regulated or mandated so by national legislation or not. Because sometimes voluntary carbon market have a bad name if they don't pertain, if they don't incorporate or correspond to certain standards. And this is exactly what this particular legal text is trying to do, trying to push for a uniform standard so that everybody who's participating in those markets can be sure that their participation actually achieve what it says or what the intention is. Yanis, do you want to talk about Article 6.2 and the guidelines that are happening in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. So Article 6.2 sets out guidelines which cover internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, which has the unhelpful abbreviation of ITMOs, between two governments that are parties to the Paris Agreement, and the ITMOs here has been used since the Kyoto Protocol. So this is really something that has been around already. People might have heard about it before, and it's been used and folded into the new system again, because it is really seen as kind of an extension or maybe an improvement of the Kyoto Protocol systems, which have been criticized in the past. And here governments have really adopted new environmental integrity rules that aim to ensure that all recorded carbon credits use verifiable and comparable accounting systems, and that no traded unit or ITMO, as I mentioned, leads to a net increase in emissions of participating parties within and between nationally determined contributions implementation periods, which is all provided for, specifically outlined within Article 6.2. And for anybody who wants to look this up, it's D17. And this is really important to consider this link, of course, between what carbon markets do and what the NDCs of countries do. And that's something that we'll pick up again in the context of Article 6.4. But I'm going to hand over back to Silke for Article 6.4 and kind of the overview of how Article 6.4 works.
Thank you, because Article 6.4 is actually the article in the Paris Agreement that establishes this new, as yet unnamed, multilateral mechanism. I'm sure there will be an abbreviation that will come up with in due course, and that this new mechanism will then resemble the function of the former Clean Development Mechanism. So, for instance, there will be, just as there was before, a supervisory board that would approve all projects that fall within the scope of Article 6.4. But it might also allow some technical flexibility. So what is foreseen under Article 6.4 is that there will be a centralized project authorization system with a new supervisory board. Again, there's not a name yet. A central accounting framework, a central registry. This is actually a function that you might recognize from the European Union Central Registry, and an Article 6 database of all relevant projects and details. However, there's some issue around the implementation, because there was a recent report by the Asian Development Bank which has suggested that it might take until 2030 for all the requisite measures to be put in place so that the article mechanism common approaches, as they're often labeled, could actually be developed. And that's obviously a time frame which is quite long. And bearing in mind that many countries might rely on carbon reduction delivery through these carbon markets under Article 6, has the potential to delay reduction efforts. So that's critical and should probably be reviewed, and countries should probably sort of look at speeding that timeline up if possible. Article 6.4 does also a number of other things. Often we hear about double counting, what counts exactly as the reduction, where is it counted, how is it counting. So Article 6.4 addresses the whole double counting issue as well.
And if maybe just coming in on the double counting point, this is really where we loop back to NDCs, because in the context, kind of if we just create a hypothetical example here, If we have, for example, a project that creates carbon credits in one country, but these certificates would be sold to another country, which is something that Article 6.4 enables you to do. That of course means that the benefit of the decarbonization efforts or of the kind of carbon capture efforts are transferred from one country to another. So what the double counting or the corresponding adjustment here means is that not both countries are supposed to be able to claim effectively the benefit of these projects. So the country that transfers or sells this benefit to another country effectively has to reduce that benefit from its own kind of NDC achievement record, so that it's only used by the respective country that has financed the relevant achievements.
And I think this is starting to get quite complicated already. And then in COP26 in Glasgow, the negotiators agreed on top of that roughly 5% of what is called the share of proceeds from carbon markets linked to the Article 6.4 multilateral mechanism would then be transferred to the Global Adaptation Fund, which would help developing countries in turn finance their own effort to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So there's quite a lot of detail packed in Article 6.4, and well, it remains to be seen how this is developed at COP27.
Thank you. But you've also done a very good job of expressing that in terms of the broad goals and objectives, and I think the double counting concept, we've heard a lot about that, but it's you've expressed that very clearly. As you say, we've kind of had a deep dive into Article 6.4. Could you just talk much more broadly about where we are in terms of the overall Article 6 implementation? I think that's for Silke again.
Thank you, Gillian. So yes, so the Paris Agreement Rulebook, or the Paris Rulebook for International Cooperation for Carbon Markets, was published as part of COP26, and there was some guidance in there for countries in relation to environmental integrity, the avoidance of double counting, which Yanis has just elaborated a little bit, but also how to incentivize private capital into developing countries. Now, in theory, that should have led to more ambitious NDCs, or national climate action plans. However, it's difficult to say globally whether that has actually happened, and that will need to be assessed on a country-by-country basis. So very often when we talk about Article 6, we talk about how to operationalize these articles, and that is really a key of what will hopefully happen at COP27. So this talks about the infrastructure, so the registries, the databases, and reporting platforms that are necessary to make international carbon markets operational, will need to be considered in a fair amount of detail, and then also be applied to non-market mechanisms. So the supervisory body, as yet nameless, that I mentioned earlier, was actually created in June of this year to implement the 6.4, the international carbon markets element. The supervisory body aims to operationalize this Article 6.4 mechanism, and that will include the development of a series of further regulations, which will be considered at COP27. Then the supervisory board has met for the first time in July, and as you would expect, it really started by setting out some rules of procedure and adopting a proposed work plan for the next 2 years, which would take us to, I suppose, 2024. And the supervisory body also pulled together a number of recommendations to be put to the parties at COP27. So here we have proposals on the fee structure, appropriate levels for proceed sharing, so that's about the 5% share of proceeds that I mentioned earlier, which also discusses contributions to the adaptation fund, and importantly on the methodology, including in relation to carbon removals. And that was actually quite recently, last month, and the minutes of that were meant to be published earlier, actually last week. However, I'm not sure that that has happened. I haven't found anything online. And then we're now looking forward to COP27, where there will be the third meeting of the supervisory body. And Yanis, I think the agenda has just been published.
Yes, indeed. The agenda has been published on this, which is of course always good to know that that's taken forward. But one thing maybe to take a step back and to give the context about why this implementation phase is so important. Of course, the Paris Agreement was entered into in 2015, and that means it's already 7 years ago, and it has taken an extremely long time, 6 years. 1 year we can, I guess, maybe deduct because of COVID delays, to finalize the rule book. So we already in some kind of lines of argumentation behind schedule with regards to getting this really running, which is why it's so important that this is driven forward at COP27, and that we really getting to the nitty gritty of the implementation phase, and starting to get kind of operational benefits to implement these markets more commonly globally.
Thank you. I mean, it's so important to actually get that pace, and I think the frustration is building, and certainly, you know, we can see at Chapter Zero the expectation that we need to be, you know, taking real steps towards decarbonisation. But I wanted to come back to the voluntary carbon markets. I mean, how do these markets function? Who are the players? Who's involved? How does this work? Again, perhaps if I start with Silke and then to Yanis.
Maybe I'll take the first one, and then so when we look at carbon markets, let's really start with who is involved. Now we can split this into 4 groups of kind of parties. At first we have the project. So these are the projects that will ultimately produce the carbon credits. Then we have standard organizations, which are responsible to identify baseline standards that the projects have to comply with. And with the standards kind of are linked to the verification process that these relevant project credits are real and actual carbon emission savings. Then you have registries where these emission certificates are held, because ultimately we're not talking about tangible assets as such. So the credit has to be somewhere, and that is a registry, which we can imagine like a bank account or a bank that holds these in individual accounts. And then of course we have companies, which would be the users of these offset credits. Now the drivers of kind of why we need these markets, or why these markets are being used, is really a question of course, the decarbonization drive and the challenges that the companies are facing. Now we are looking at decarbonization trajectories, which have to become increasingly ambitious, and in some sectors that is particularly difficult, where there are hard to abate emissions, and generally where companies might want to achieve further reductions beyond what they can do in actual emission reductions within their organization and operations. And this is where carbon offsets really come in as a helpful tool in order to go beyond what you can change physically about your own operations by effectively using funds to support carbon offsetting means by supporting these different projects. Now, I talk about these projects in a bit of an abstract way, but it would probably be helpful at this point to kind of outline what these projects are, because they are quite a bit of difference and there's quite a large range. And we could probably split it quite helpfully into 2 classes. On the one hand, we will have the carbon avoidance projects, and on the other hand, we would have the emission removal projects. So on the carbon avoidance side, these are projects which aim to curb emissions by capturing the emissions created by carbon-intensive activities, or by preventing these activities altogether. So we would be talking about, for example, let's say a coal power plant that is coupled with carbon capture and storage. So we have a carbon-intensive form of energy, and we are removing the relevant carbon that is created through that. So we effectively kind of reducing the amount of carbon emissions caused by this activity, or by kind of removing it altogether. And the other alternative, if I was to replace that with another kind of cleaner form of of electricity in this case. On the other hand, when we talk about the emission removal projects, we are looking at projects that will cause a net positive outcome. So it doesn't just try to kind of remove existing emission, it tries to take emissions that are in the atmosphere and reduce it, so a kind of a net positive impact. And these would be things such as forest conservation projects or management, CCUS in emitting industries, and that will bring us into things such as tree restoration, agricultural soil management, or there are also some high-tech strategies which include direct air capture or enhanced mineralization, and also some hybrid strategies where bioenergy is coupled with carbon capture and storage, because of course bioenergy would be based on the carbon being sequestered into, in this case, probably wood, which would be burned, but by that carbon being captured again, and there wouldn't be any release of the previously captured carbon back into the atmosphere. So we'd actually end up with a net positive result in that sense.
Thank you. I think actually practical examples are very helpful here. You also mentioned carbon standards, and can you explain how these carbon standards work? I think is that one for Yannis as well?
Yes. So these carbon standards, as I've tried to slightly allude to earlier, it's really, let's say, the ethical compass of this that's really supposed to, maybe ethical is the wrong way, the compass that's supposed to give comfort to the ultimate investor. It is the standard, and we're talking about, and maybe that's the important difference, as Silke pointed out early on. Voluntary carbon markets are not regulated. So you need to bring in some sort of regulation and some sort of comparative tool here so that companies can actually use it. And this is what carbon standards provide. Carbon standards provide this regulatory baseline in a contractual way. It's not legally enshrined, but it's a set framework that is accessible by the relevant standard organization, and companies can inform or educate themselves about the relevant standards, what they stand for, and have the comfort that the relevant projects that are certified by the standard comply with a list of requirements and fulfill certain minimum quality marks that give me as an investor comfort that if I invest in this particular product, I am not necessarily at risk of certain particularly prevalent risks that would normally exist in the voluntary carbon market space. Some of the examples of carbon standards would be, for example, Vera. The verified carbon standard is the most common one that's being used. There's also gold standard, and these are all organizations that have either specialized on creating a standard for specific activities or for creating a standard that is applicable throughout the bench for various activities.
Thank you.
And it's perhaps just to add, there is a huge amount of creativity in the projects that Yannis has earlier described. So the different types of removal or managing of carbon. And it's always important that if you invest in such a project or interested in buying credits generated by that project, to verify what standard do they comply with in order to, and do they comply with a particular standard? Because otherwise very quickly there are risks arising out the sort of, if it's not a verified standard, then you need to be very careful as to any possible risks that are attached to that, either reputationally or misrepresentation wise.
And I'd like to really pick up on that point of risk. I mean, certainly Chapter Zero members are really committed to decarbonisation, but they're also, part of their role as board members is the oversight of risk, and particularly on this subject. I mean, I guess there's been such negative press as well. Can you just talk through, and particularly, I think for our membership, what are the risks regarding voluntary offsets and their underlying projects, and any guidance that you can provide for mitigating those risks?
Sure. I think one of the key issues is the lack of standardization. Yanis has already pointed this out regarding the various standards. This is purely contractualized. You don't have a legal, a legislative framework like you have, for instance, for the EU ETS. But that also carries through to there's no standardized or market trading documentation. Typically, in contrast to the regulated carbon market, we haven't seen yet an industry standard trading documentation emerging for voluntary carbon credits. Which means, of course, that documentation will be highly project specific and also specific to the relevant carbon market. So that means, on the one hand, it's very free flow and parties are entirely free to document and use this in a way that they wish. However, that also means in terms of risk that directors of companies would need to look very carefully whether the form of contract is appropriate in relation to the transaction, whether the underlying carbon reduction project and the applicable voluntary carbon market are actually appropriate to the organization's aim in terms of emission reduction, and thereby reducing the risks and by making those checks in reducing or allocate those risks appropriately. So it depends like where you stand on the spectrum, but there of course the lack of standardization can lead to overly buyer-friendly or overly seller-friendly documentation. So for very sophisticated market players, so from a legal perspective, this is something we would always advise directors or project leads to check very carefully. However, what we're also seeing, is that there, and I think in due course this will happen, that the various industry groups, IETA, ISDA, the templates are being developed for more standardized trading documentation, and in due course this is likely to lead to more standardization, which will help orient people in this market. And perhaps a couple of points on the legal nature, as lawyers, we tend to have an interest in there, but there's actually sort of a number of risk management tools in here, or risk management issues here. First of all, there is some degree of uncertainty what the precise legal nature of voluntary carbon credits or voluntary carbon market program providers are. So the carbon market providers often do not address directly what it actually is that you buy when you buy the certificates. It's often not addressed directly in rules and standards. And of course, it's not created by legislative or international treaty framework. So the Paris Agreement doesn't say this is what a carbon credit is, and this is at law what a voluntary carbon credit is. And this will always be governed by the law of the relevant contract that contractualizes the relevant carbon credit program. So therefore, it's important that parties look very carefully what law is applicable to the relevant program and what law is applicable to the relevant carbon credit. There are some industry efforts on the way to address this lack of consistency, but it's important to consider that from the outset, because it actually has very practical consequences as well. So, for instance, not all governing laws, or it's not always possible to take or grant security over voluntary carbon credits, depending on the jurisdiction or by the law by which they're governed. Sort of my personal hope, looking forward to COP27, is that the Paris Agreement will be built out, or the Paris rulebook will be built out to reflect some of these trends and significantly reduce the scope for those types of risks, and that these markets become a little bit more standardized in order to give more certainty to all participants. Dennis, I don't know, do you want to talk about the risks that come out of the physical elements?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, there are also some very specific physical risk and then some more general physical risk for the wider market. I'll start with the general one, and then I'm going to go specific. So on the one hand, because there has been a really rapid expansion with regards to kind of the voluntary carbon market, we are looking at a very highly fragmented market at the moment, and that ties in with some of the bits that Silke has mentioned with regards to kind of the regulatory ambiguity. But it does really mean, because it's developed so quickly, that the differences between various standards and kind of the types of projects and that ambiguity can be quite a high threshold for companies to enter and to know exactly what they're obtaining, because ultimately you want to make sure that you have a good quality offset, and the risk of poor quality offsets really do risk that we are delaying net zero, and by supporting effectively projects that don't necessarily meet the requirements or the standard that a company would have normally expected to buy when they're buying carbon offsets. When we speak about physical risk, we also mean actual physical risk. So when we look particularly at nature-based solutions, which forestry projects, which are particularly popular in the voluntary market space, these have a lot of physical risk factors with them. You have forest fires, droughts, flooding, or other extreme weather conditions like storms that could very seriously affect the relevant project, the relevant assets specifically. And in the case of forests, when the project is damaged, there is, for example, in light of a forest fire, there's an imminent risk that the carbon that has been sequestered before is actually released back to the atmosphere. So you would actually negate all previously created emission savings by bringing them back. And that, of course, is a massive risk for somebody who's bought these credits, because ultimately what they would now be holding is hot air, or I guess CO2 that is now in the atmosphere rather than what they paid for. And that could, of course, lead with it very, very strong reputational consequences, even though it wasn't something that was intended. And here, this is not something that is necessarily that niche. A lot of very large companies in the US were affected by this, because if we think about forest fires, this is something that has been happening on an increasingly larger scale every year, with forest fire season in the US and in Europe as well as Australia, just increasing every year on year. And projects are taking this on board, and that's something that some of the standards are also integrating more and more. So, for example, with regards to these forestry projects, there have to be buffer zones that effectively represent an amount of credits that would not be able to be sold. So effectively, let's say if we have let's imagine again a hypothetical project that could create 1,000 credits. We are always at any point only selling 500, and the rest is the buffer zone. However, depending on how these buffer zones are planned or budgeted for, that is where there could be some integrity problems, because that could ultimately lead to damage that goes beyond what the buffer provides for. And I did briefly mention the kind of reputational side of things, and that's something that's quite important to kind of keep in mind as we think about the wider ESG context of this all, which is that a lot of this, of course, is also judged by public consensus. And because it's an unregulated space, projects that might still be absolutely acceptable and supported today, public opinion could sway and could no longer support that as a viable emission reduction project in the future. And that's really something to stay on top of, to kind of keep that pulse as a company, and to plan ahead for that, to kind of try to see and identify what is the most long-term sustainable solution here. And the recommendation, even though it means it might be more expensive, is really to think about it not only as a short-term opportunity to decarbonize, but also as something that can have longer impacts for the company and should be assessed from a risk perspective just the same.
Thank you. A lot to digest there. And if I may, I'd like to come back on the point you raised latterly, because I guess you were leading towards some of the accusations that companies face of greenwashing. And I would be interested the extent to which sort of greenwashing accusations leveled at companies have been associated with carbon markets. I mean, there are a number of dimensions to greenwashing, as we know. And I'd also be really interested in, what would be your very practical advice to somebody who's sitting on a board, who's overseeing the, proposals that are coming from the executive. What are some of the sort of the very practical tips that you would be giving that they can be discharging their duty, both towards net zero, but also towards an appropriate kind of risk framework? So I'm not quite sure who wants to take which part of those two questions, but if I could raise the greenwashing question, which we haven't actually mentioned yet, and
okay,
your take on that.
Sure, I can take perhaps the greenwashing question, and Yanis, you can sort of go over to the practical tips. So greenwashing is of course a risk, but greenwashing ultimately is always a material risk if a project, carbon offsetting, a carbon project, a carbon market, doesn't do what it's expected to do and what it says that it does. And I think it's wrong to tarnish all carbon projects like, oh, there's a greenwashing risk. It is really important to look, what are the standards that the project is setting out to cover? By what standards is it governed? Does it hold up to the verification, the reporting, sort of those sort of elements? That is really important. It is also really important to look how, for instance, the scenarios that Yanis has spoken of, forest fires, what happens if a project gets destroyed by accident, by impact of climate change or in any other shape or form. How are the carbon credits then treated? Because what you want to avoid as somebody who runs those projects, but also somebody who invests perhaps in carbon credits from the relevant project, that there's an accusation that you literally hold a certificate for hot air. So that would be really bad, both for the project, for the standard, but also ultimately for the company that is using those certificates for their own net zero and carbon decarbonization efforts. So I think I would just refer back to, it is really important to look at the standards, make sure that your company invests into a reputable standard, that you have verified, that you're confident that they make a net positive impact in relation to the relevant decarbonisation program. Now, I've sort of veered already in Yanis's territory in terms of the practical tips, but ultimately they're quite closely
connected.
Yeah.
They are absolutely, and maybe also to kind of tie back to Silke's things, because in some ways the waters also muddy there in a bit, because it should always be differentiated between just generally the use of carbon offsets, and then what are the offsets used for, and how is the use of offsets communicated. And I think they're two separate pitfalls. Silke already dealt with the quality of the credits and making sure that there's no greenwashing going on with regards to the quality of what you're using. But then there's that additional level where we're talking about, I'm selling a carbon neutral product, but I'm reaching my carbon neutrality only through offsets. That is something that in and of itself has to be communicated more clearly, where if I decide to offset the emissions of a product that I'm selling, that I then provide very clearly references to the way that this is being done, and I make it quite clear in my communication that it's not the product itself that is carbon neutral, but it's achieved something because we're offsetting that separately. And that's kind of also something where markets are becoming much more, or regulators and the public are becoming much more tuned to challenging these claims that are being made with regards to advertising or marketing with regards to the use of offsets. So maybe that in that context. But on the practical side of things, I think it draws on what Silke said. It's really kind of quality over quantity is really an important thing here, and also to think when it comes to the quality, not let the quality stop with regards to just the environmental impact of the relevant offset, but also thinking about it more wholesomely in an ESG context. You want to make sure that there might not be any unintended human rights implication with regards to how these projects are run, checking with regards to the relevant jurisdictional implications depending on where these projects are and what standards are followed there, to make sure that while you're trying to achieve something that is great with regards to decarbonization and climate change, you're not inadvertently exposing yourself to a corporation that bites you on another ESG heading effectively, but by an all-inclusive assessment criteria is much more likely to get a net benefit outcome as management.
Thank you. Sorry, Silke.
No, just one point, Steve. I think that ultimately it comes down to transparency as one of the key values that directors need to be aware of, I suppose. Transparency about the intention and the methodology and the ultimate result. And that's just good old, I suppose, standard practice, isn't it, Gillian?
Absolutely. And it's a very clear guidance. I had a slightly more perhaps detailed question from a board perspective, and I don't know if either of you have a sort of a view on where the scrutiny is taking place in organisations. I mean, you've described very complex markets and also markets that are evolving, almost as we speak. I'd be interested, at board level, are you seeing scrutiny in the ESG committee? Are you seeing it in the audit committee? Or is it, what's being passed through the executive? Any guidance or any visibility that you have as to where the scrutiny is taking place within the governance structure?
So we're seeing in practice a wide variety. So we're seeing companies who say we have an ESG committee and this is where it's taking place. My challenge to the ESG committee or the company that not like that would be you need to have a clear link to the board, because it's the directors who are responsible for the company, and there's clear responsibility on the shoulders of the directors. Sometimes we're seeing it, there's scrutiny is taking place in the relevant trading or in the trading arm of a company or in the project developing side. Again, it is important that there's a clear reporting line from the individual projects, from ESG committee all the way back to the board. The board needs to set the standards. How does this organization deal with carbon emissions, carbon decarbonization? How is that done? And making sure that they're setting the standards and there's a clear reporting line. I think that is best practice. Sometimes we see companies who say, oh, but everybody is dealing with ESG, everybody is dealing with carbon decarbonization. The risk there is, if they're not clear reporting lines, that if everybody is doing it, nobody is doing it. So being really clear on the governance front is important. I think Gillian, directors have, and also in particular non-executive directors, have a role here in pushing that and raising awareness in that context.
Thank you. Yanis.
No, and all in all, that just kind of leads again to internal transparency, to having, as Silke says, clear reporting lines, but at the same time also really making sure that the left hand talks to the right hand and vice versa, and that where there is overlap, kind of in the wider ESG context, that things are not siloed into one or the other. This is just decarbonization, this is just social impact, but that actually people are used kind of in a crossover to make sure that every project actually reaches the best possible outcome on all of the different criteria, and that there's not risk kind of that comes in through the back door accidentally and might cause unexpected but large consequences later on.
Thank you. And I think you've been very consistent about emphasising the need to think about the broader implications, the just transition, ESG and the sort of kind of connectivity and intersectionality there. I am keeping an eye on the time, and fascinating as this is, I know we have time limits. I'd like to sort of close. I've asked about where the scrutiny is taking place within companies, within boards. I'd be interested in both your perspectives on the level of sophistication you're seeing in terms of shareholders and in terms of stakeholders. You've talked about the reputational implications. How well equipped are shareholders and stakeholders to hold companies to account?
I would say I would provide a trajectory, a perspective on this. I think that we had this discussion about 5 years. Decarbonization, climate change might have been sort of an outlier sort of topic that might have been raised by activist shareholders in a particular way. But increasingly, we're seeing shareholders, stakeholders getting much more sophisticated. They're informing themselves, and climate change has moved to center stage, or decarbonization for many companies, in particular in what I would call my home sector, in the energy sector. It has moved center stage, and it is a key issue, and we're seeing much more sophisticated questions, and it's almost normal to have a discussion as to how a company is setting about achieving decarbonization efforts. We're also seeing that in the reporting season. So many companies now have, either because they're covered by the Non-Financial Disclosure Directive in Europe or the UK equivalent, we're seeing many companies now having sustainability reports addressing the decarbonization efforts head on, explaining their methodology and their strategy. And again, here, transparency and regular disclosure and updates on the efforts are really important. Overall, I'm reasonably optimistic because I'm just seeing a lot more question and a lot more sophistication in the type of questions that we're seeing.
Thank you. Yanis, a word from you.
Really, just to second Sirka's last comment, that we are really seeing an absolute increase in debate around these topics, which just show, of course, on the one hand, an increase in interest, but also sophistication and kind of across stakeholders with regards to these topics, which of course is kind of happen at the same time as these markets be kind of gaining in complexity. So it's a very welcome feature, but there's definitely a journey for voluntary carbon markets and carbon markets more generally, but it's something that will in a way be very important to happen, and they're only going to become more complex as things are becoming more and more global going forward.
Thank you. I mean, this is certainly such an important topic for companies, for investors, and certainly for Chapter Zero. You know, any Chapter Zero members who are sitting on audit committees, ESG committees, well, and as Silke said, I mean, a director is a director, and this is an enormously important subject. I'd like to thank you both for your very lucid explanations of a subject that's moving very fast, that has actually received quite a lot of negative press, and I know is perplexing for many companies, but also creates a real opportunity and pathway towards decarbonisation. So I'm deeply grateful for the explanation and the lucidity that you've brought to this subject. I would also I should have put in a little plea at the beginning for those who are listening, who are board members and aren't members of Chapter Zero, please do sign up. This is one aspect of the excellent education and insights that are available, and we currently have 2,200 members in the UK, and I think about 2/3 of the FTSE 100 will have at least one board member who's a member of Chapter Zero. But let me again thank both Silke and Yanis. It's been very enlightening, and I really appreciate the insight and the patience that you've brought to taking us through this very complex topic. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Gillian, for the questions and for taking the time for doing this with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Combating climate change is the biggest engineering project on the planet, and there are solutions. Because there is action. Braskem is removing CO2 from the atmosphere in the production of chemicals and plastics from plants, using more and more renewable energy sources,
improving the energy efficiency
of our industrial units, and developing technology to transform the greenhouse gases emitted into new products. Because there is only one way to make a more sustainable future. Together,